to the number 9 slot. But when people look at recent Guam history, they often always put these two names together. And so it's important to talk about them together because we began this class looking at the spirit of the Magahaga, Fa'una, sort of the matrilineal, matrifocal sort of force that runs through the culture. And so at this part in Guam history and Chamorro history, we're talking about a time when that is something which is heavily debated. What does that mean? What does it look like? What is it actually? Sort of this idea of Chamorro women, Chamorro womanhood, the strength and the power of that. What does it look like? And so for today we are for mina'sigua number 9. We are looking at Senator Elizabeth Arriola and Anita Arriola. Senator Elizabeth Arriola, also known as Belle Arriola, and then Anita Arriola. And so one of the things that first makes this story very interesting is that these two women are mother and daughter. Elizabeth Arriola, seen here sitting down. She was a multiple-term senator in the Guam legislature. She was a strong force in the Catholic Church, the Christian Mothers. She was a huge political force for her husband, who is Joaquin Arriola, who was twice elected Speaker of the Guam legislature. She was one of the main forces which defeated casino gambling on Guam. When it was first proposed, one archbishop and then another archbishop both requested that she sort of help lead the effort to defeat it, and she was successful, something that one of her daughters also has carried on and continued on. Her daughter, Anita Arriola, seen here, is an attorney, sort of an attorney, and there was an issue in 1990 which put these two on different sides of a very contentious debate. And that debate was the abortion debate in Guam, pro-choice, anti-choice, pro-life, anti-abortion, and so on. That debate came to Guam, and it was something which actually extended out into the United States itself. Guam became the center for a short period of the debate around abortion within the United States. And so one thing that I want to get to sort of position these two, because we've been talking about Chamorro identity and sort of the way in which what we're choices, right? About what's important, what's valuable, what is essential to us, what is not essential, and so on. And so one thing to note about these two women is that Belle Arriola was born before World War II. If I remember correctly, 1928. So she was a young woman in World War II, teenager. She experienced hardship. Her grandmother, I believe, died on the march to Menengan. And after the war, she was part of that generation of Chamorros that were sent off island to go to get educated in the States. And one thing that she always liked to say about herself was that she left island with no country, because Chamorros were at that time nationals of the United States. They had no real rights or place within the United States. But when she returned after finishing her college degree in '52, she was suddenly a US citizen. And so that experience of, oh man, I charged this. Sorry, I really need to get new headphones. I keep getting headphones and they keep dying on me. One second, I'm gonna call in with my phone, so at least, if any of you are looking for Tsensuli gifts for me, headphones, because if you're on Zooming all day, I have 2 sets of headphones and I have to keep charging them all the time because one dies and then I have to switch over. Give me 1 second to spend Zoom. I'll join on my phone, so at least there's the audio. doesn't help.
All right. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. So that issue is interesting because then you look at Anita Arriola, who was born a US citizen after the Organic Act, born in much long after World War II, sort of born with basically the United States filling the world around her. American laws, American education, American citizenship. She went to school in the States. She had sort of a solid liberal arts, very good education as an attorney. She sort of, her friends were progressive feminists primarily. She worked for the ACLU when she was in the States, in San Francisco, before coming to Guam in the late 80s, coming back to Guam in the late 80s. And so you can see then in some ways their ideas of the world would be slightly to very different because of how they were born into it. Similar to, for example, Belle Arriola, born in 1928 when the United States had been established on Guam, may have had a very different perspective than her parents and her grandparents. Her parents likely were born into the time when America had not really been settled yet into Guam, and her grandparents were born under the Spanish. And so that sense, that context can affect a lot about how you perceive things, especially something like CHamoru culture and what is right in terms of politics or government and so on. And we can see it in the debate that happens on the island. So two things to sort of point out. Many of us, of course, are familiar with the decision Roe v. Wade in 1973. Roe v. Wade made it so that it is a woman's right to have legal access to abortion and reproductive health services. All right. Now, after Roe versus Wade is passed, there are a number of challenges over the next decade and a half to it from different, usually conservative, religiously motivated groups trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. And Webster versus Reproductive Health Services in 1989 is a big case because what the Supreme Court does is that it says, of course, that you can never prohibit a woman from having an abortion. You can never completely sort of get rid of that. A woman has a right to this. But states individually can put limits on that right. So what happens after that then is that different states put forth different laws, right? So one of the first ones is a state then makes it so that a woman under a certain age, in order to have a legal abortion, has to get permission from two of her parents or a judge in the state, or that there's sort of a waiting period, that if you go in to have an appointment for an abortion, there is a number of days that have to be waited before you can go back to actually have that. And so this is sort of the context in which Guam's abortion law comes into play, is that all these groups in different states across the United States are trying to limit access to abortion in different ways. And then Guam steps forward, and Guam shocks just about everybody in what it comes up with. So one of the things that's interesting about this, though, is that the late Senator Concepcion Barrett, or Chong, as they called her, and so in her time in the legislature, when she was the only woman senator in the 70s, she quietly passed a law, because abortion was illegal on Guam. She quietly passed a law making it so that a woman could request, that it was legal for a woman to request an abortion from a local physician. Now, the church didn't say anything about it at that time because the church hadn't really taken a strong position on abortion at that time. It wasn't a political player in terms of this debate, in terms of this issue. And Chong Barrett, she worked with the male colleagues. She got it through with very little debate, with very little argument, basically feeling strongly that women should have access to this if they need it. That was in 1978, I believe. And so that's one thing to think about, is that when 1990, the year we're focusing on, when that comes around, Guam has shifted, where now Guam has joined more of the anti-choice, pro-life debate that's happening in the United States. And many people don't actually realize that abortion is legal in Guam because of this move by Senator Chong Barrett in the 70s to quietly allow women to have access to this. So Senator Arriola, now she was a senator that undertook a lot of different things. One of the things that she absolutely deserves credit for is that she is known as the mother of historic preservation, because she created the law for the Guam Preservation Trust. But she is most well known for her abortion sort of law, her abortion legislation. And in interviews after this, before she died in 2002, she made clear that she was aware of what was happening in the States and that she strongly believed that Guam should also take a stand, that as other people were seeking to restrict abortion, protect the life of the unborn, protect their communities from abortion, that she felt strongly that CHamoros and people on Guam also needed to take stands like this. And she had asked the Catholic Church and organizations associated with the Catholic Church if they would be willing to support her efforts, and they enthusiastically said yes. The Archbishop Aparon was this is long before he became disgraced in a lot of the ways that he has been now, but at that time he was a strongly political figure, and he was very excited sort of that Bell Arriola was going to take this on. So Bill 848, according to Arriola, when she first told her legal counsel, her policy advisors, to draft the bill, she said, we want to basically prohibit abortion. We want to try to get away with as much as we can legally to prevent women from getting abortions. And eventually, when the bill was put forth, different senators offered amendments to it, and so it was changed in session. But what eventually came out from it, though, that it was an outright ban with a very, very narrow exception. There was no exceptions for rape. There was no exceptions for incest. And there was only a very narrow exception for a woman's life being endangered, and you had to get two doctors to sign off on your situation to be willing to put on the record that if you did not get this, you were going to die. If you did not have an abortion, you were going to die. And one thing which made this very different than anywhere else in the United States was that Bill 848 had a solicitation clause in it, which meant that it was a crime in the same way in which it's a crime to tell people where they can have prostitutes, where they can, use prostitutes, drugs, other illicit, illegal activity. Bill 848 made it so that if you told people about abortion services, it was against the law. Getting an abortion was a felony, and you could also be arrested if you informed people about where they could get abortions. And so on the right here, this is a flyer which was made after the law was passed, and it said, this is from pro-choice groups who were hoping that the legislature would repeal the law. There was possibility that there was going to be a referendum in November to strike down the law, because it basically, this bill 848 was the most restrictive abortion law in the United States and its territories. It went further than any other state had ever gone before, and even the solicitation clause was thought to be it was thought to be I don't want to say crazy, because it was reaching further in terms of obstructing and inhibiting than any other. than anything else people had come up with. Now, one of the things that we should preface this debate with, though, Guam's self-determination and Chamorro self-determination versus federal laws and federal restrictions. But it also came down to Chamorro culture and abortion. So for Belle Arriola and Christian mothers and people who were strong, sort of outwardly strong in their Catholic faith, they felt strongly that abortion and Chamorro culture are opposites. That Chamorro culture is about families, Chamorro women are about motherhood, and therefore abortion is the opposite. It is an anathema to all of the things that Chamorro culture is supposed to be about. Those who argued in favor of abortion rights put forth the fact that Chamorros had a word for abortion, and that actually, if you talk to different Surahanas, there was medicines that were designed to induce abortions. There was practices that had been established for women to get abortions. The word poka means to shatter, to crack, to break something, and it's also the word for abortion. And so this debate continued. And in fact, those who argued against abortion in Chamorro culture said that just because there's a word for it, it doesn't mean that it's socially acceptable. So for example, Belle Arriola and Archbishop Apron argued that the fact that sort of the word abortion in Chamorro is kind of slang means it's a taboo word. So you don't openly talk about it, you whisper about it. So it's not socially acceptable to get it, it's something that you have to do privately, and there's shame associated with it. But this is an important thing. One proposed that sort of Chamorro culture is all about motherhood, community, a very collectivist assessment of what a woman is supposed to be. Whereas the other side argued very individualized sense of a woman, that a woman first and foremost has rights to her body, and she then can choose, if she wants to have children, what she is to the community, not the other way around. All of this brings up the issue of separation of church and state. And in Guam, one of the things that people often point to is that there wasn't historically much separation of church and state. For example, during the Spanish period, there was very little separation of church and state because many countries didn't have separation of church and state in the past. The United States has had that, although there have been times when it's been blurred, absolutely been blurred. But in Guam, the cathedral in Hagåtña is right across the street from the Guam Congress building, the Guam legislature. And so that has often been used as a metaphor to show the lack of separation of church and state in Guam. That sort of the church has traditionally had a very strong role in politics. And this is actually one of those things that shows that. So while Belle Arriola was passing this bill, getting support from other legislators, getting support from the community, her daughter Anita, a young attorney on Guam, calls the ACLU in the United States, in San Francisco. And she is put in touch with this woman, Janet Benshuf, who, I may be pronouncing her name wrong, Benshuf, it's something like that. She is in charge of the Reproductive Rights Center for the ACLU. Anita sends Janet a copy of the law that is being proposed on Guam, and basically says, and Janet decides within 2 days to fly to Guam. That the next front in the war, in the battle for the rights of women to have access to legal abortions and to control what happens to their own bodies, that Guam will be the new front. And for a lot of people, that's completely unexpected. It's completely unexpected. 848 is passed. At that time, the legislature was 21 senators, and the law was passed unanimously 21-0. And according to legend, the Archbishop denies this. Lots of people say it was true, that the Archbishop was in the balcony overlooking the Guam Congress floor, watching the senators as they voted, as they debated, and that a local reporter quoted him as saying that he would excommunicate anyone who voted against the abortion ban. There was little debate on the floor once it actually got there. So the now this was a Democratic majority in Guam, which was kind of shocking to people in the States where Democrats were mainly associated with pro-choice abortion rights for women. The Democratic legislators had met in caucus, they'd added amendments, agreed there would be no debate. And that, as Amy Goodman wrote in her article, Territory in Turmoil that year, Guam had passed the strictest abortion law in the country at that time. So one of the interesting things at this time is that Lujan Guerrero she's the Magahaga now, but this experience is what pushes her towards politics. She was a nurse, and she was the former president of the Guam Nurses Association at that time. And she was much more liberal. She believed in sort of the rights of women over their own bodies, the rights of a woman to choose. And so she asked a lot of the senators why they signed this bill, because they were friends of hers. And she said, Lou, some of them said, Lou, what do you think you would do if you were sitting there and you had the Archbishop looking down at you and he knows your mom and dad? It's almost like their principles were compromised because of the threat of excommunication. To me, that's not democracy, it's rule by fear. And so Lou becomes more politicized because of this experience. And soon after, within a few years of this debate happening in Guam, she runs for senator in Guam. And later after that, she runs as the lieutenant governor under Tom Adda in 1998, although she does not win. And so on the right here, this is from Lou was part of an organization for choice and life, People for Choice. And so this is from one of the newsletters that they put out there. And there was an election that year. Governor Adda was seeking to be reelected. Again, 86, 90, 90, 94, yeah. Was seeking to be reelected. And so pro-choice advocates were pushing that, him signing this law should hurt his political chances. People shouldn't vote for him. His signing this law was overwhelmingly popular. And he easily won. He easily won re-election. And in fact, studies shown by, surveys done by the University of Guam at that time showed that amongst Filipinos overwhelmingly supported Joe Adda because of his anti-abortion stance. Chamorros largely supported him, whereas Caucasians, whites in Guam, were against his position. So Governor Joseph Adda, he signed Bill 848, and it became Public Law 20-134. And he made a lot of statements about why he was passing this. And he even acknowledged that the law was much stricter and much stronger and more extreme than his own personal beliefs about what should be done. But he recognized that there was a need for something like this. In signing the law, he wrote, for example, he put in his statement, "I am not taking this action to affect anyone's life in the 50 states. I believe that this is a community issue and a community concern first and foremost." He said, and that was an important idea that supporters of the bill used, is that this is our community. We should be able to, we don't do this because we want to overturn Roe v. Wade in the United States. Your average person on Guam who supported this didn't necessarily care about Roe v. Wade at that time. They didn't like abortion. The church was saying abortion's bad. They believed strongly, all lives matter, even unborn lives matter. And so, they supported this, and that Adda believed that Guam should have the ability to take these steps to protect its sense of community, to protect its culture. And it was something that Senator Arriola, Archbishop Apron, and others continuously echoed, is that this is our community and we should have the right to do something like this. And he also chastised America in some of his statements, because there was all these ideas that this is going to hurt people in the US, that it's going to hurt their rights. And then Atta reminded that the people of Guam have suffered a lot for America. He says, our people fought in many wars. In the Korean War and in Vietnam, we had the most people die per capita than any other state in the Union. Our people were willing to die to give life and freedom, and I can't fathom why we cannot dedicate ourselves to helping bring out these unborn kids. Janet Benshoff, when she arrived in Guam, she gave a speech. The ACLU referred to the passage of this law as the Pearl Harbor for women's rights, because this was like a surprise. Because within sort of pro-choice circles in the United States, they saw PL 2134 as being like this surprise attack on women in the United States, because no one thought that anything important in this fight over women's rights would ever come from Guam. And then suddenly, the most savage and brutal assault in their mind comes from Guam. And so people weren't prepared. In fact, when Janet Benshoff got off the plane, she was picked up at the airport by Anita Arriola, and Janet hugged Anita and said, I have no idea where I am. It takes so long to get here. Because a lot of people who were in this debate didn't know much about Guam, but suddenly had to learn about Guam, suddenly had to sort of connect the dots as to why Guam was even important in this discussion. And so in order to get things started, sort of because when a law like this is passed, now the rules are a little bit different now, but you usually have to have some standing to challenge something like this. So somebody has to show that they've been injured or something has been inhibited or prevented by it, get more, and you usually need to get more attention to it. And so Janet gave a speech to the Guam Press Club when she was on island, and this image, she talked about the dangers of this law, she talked about how it was unconstitutional, and she also held up pamphlets from Hawaii about how women on Guam, if they needed to, they could fly to Hawaii, they could get reproductive services there if they were unable to get them on Guam. As soon as she finished her speech, she was arrested by Guam Police Department. She was released soon after, but she was charged with violating the solicitation clause of the new law, of the new anti-abortion law. Because as I said, if you even told somebody, if somebody was thinking about getting an abortion and you said, well, you know, you can always check out this doctor, that was considered to be against the law at that time. To sort of even further complicate things in this, so we have Bella Arriola on one side and we have Anita Arriola on the other. But even Elizabeth Barrett Anderson, who later became the Attorney General for Guam and who was the legal counsel to Joe Atta, she had given a legal opinion on Bill 848 in the Guam legislature, and she had advised them that the bill was completely unconstitutional and that it shouldn't be passed. However, then once it did become law, her role then shifted, and because it is a statute of Guam, she then became somebody who had to fight to protect that law, even if she was personally against it, or even if legally she felt that it was not right. And Elizabeth Barrett Anderson, oh, there should be two T's there, excuse me. She is the daughter of Chong Barrett, who decades earlier had quietly made it so that women had access to reproductive rights on Guam. Now, Guam made national headlines because of this. And if you think about how sometimes in Hollywood movies, Guam gets used as like a punchline in jokes, Guam got used in a lot of interesting ways by the national media because of this. Now, a lot of national media absolutely chastised Guam, attacked Guam. Dwayne Wickham, who had a long-time USA Today column, he wrote that once an outpost of American democracy, Guam is now Guam is now leading the assault on the civil liberties of US citizens. The LA Times came out with an editorial talking about Guam's grotesque muddle, attacking the law and attacking Guam, the absurd, the constitutional drama, the absurd, the theater of the absurd. And the Washington Post, newspapers across the United States, condemned Guam for sort of for passing this law, which so clearly violated things such as the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade, but also the First Amendment of the Constitution, that sort of telling somebody where they can get an abortion, if it's protected by Supreme Court precedent, then you cannot violate somebody's free speech and say that it is against the law to talk about something which it is clearly legal to do within the United States. But so Guam, this was one of those times when Guam was quote unquote put on the map yet again for the United States. And Guam absolutely got connected to American politics because of this. Now, I said that the media was very critical of Guam, but across the United States, for conservative groups and for religious groups, Guam was highlighted as like a heroic place for what it was doing. And so, for example, people from Guam, such as Archbishop Aparon and even Bella Arriola, were invited to go and give speeches at conferences for evangelicals, for Catholics, speaking to huge audiences, talking about in Guam, they're fighting the fight against sort of secularism, fighting to protect sort of the lives of the unborn, to protect their culture, their community, their faith. And so, as we'll see later, Aparon in particular gave a very interesting and compelling speech in Chicago in 1990, sort of bringing out Guam's issues and connecting it, talking about Guam's particular story in this, but also connecting it to the movements that were happening in the United States. And so Patricia Perry, she was quoted, she was the head of Guamanians United for Life at that time, and she was quoted a lot in the newspaper. The church held a huge rally with thousands of people in support of this public law. And Patricia Perry gave a speech at that, which CNN then broadcast live. 4-minute speech broadcasted live in the United States. And so she made a lot of interesting statements. One of them, she argued, is that Guam is going to be the stone that David Souter, who was a Republican appointed Supreme Court justice at that time, is going to use as the David who slays Goliath, the Goliath that is abortion. And so actually, no. So because the response from the community was so swift, there was a lot of, as Maria Doe, who filed the lawsuit, which we'll talk about, she was afraid. She was afraid. In fact, when she went to try to find an attorney, she wore a mask. She wore like a Halloween mask to try to hide her identity because she was afraid. But no, because the law was stayed very quickly because of legal action, no one else was arrested and no one else got into legal trouble because of the law. So what Pat Perry was hoping for is that Guam would basically help the United States as a whole defeat this menace that is abortion. That Guam would be the thing that plays, it's like the straw that breaks the camel's back. Guam would be just the little edge that was needed for the pro-life, anti-choice side of the country to really push ahead and win. And so she was arguing that David Souter, who had been appointed by George H.W. Bush, and that they assumed that he was going to be a very conservative justice, that if the case in Guam went to the Supreme Court, he would be the new deciding vote that would be there to overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, on the other side, Guam became connected to all of these feminist groups, abortion rights groups. Even 2 years later, Jesse Jackson came to Guam. He was protested, he was supported. But Guam also gained attention from within the United States for fighting against the law too. But it was a tense and interesting time, because at that point in 1990, Guam was pushing for the Commonwealth Bill, which would have improved Guam's status within the United States. And the senators who strongly supported that tend to be liberal Democrats. But after Ada signed this into law, he received letters, and I have one, but I didn't have time to put it into the PowerPoint, from people like Barbara Boxer, in California. Democratic, liberal, progressive leaders from across the United States, who basically said, as long as you are taking this stance, then we cannot support the movement for Commonwealth for Guam, arguing that if Guam is going to use these new powers to infringe on women's rights, then no, we can't go in that direction. Now, the law was struck down. So the law was appealed almost immediately, and in the federal court on Guam, the law was quickly struck down. It was appealed, and it was also the sort of the striking down was reaffirmed. And so it was affirmed, it was struck down within the United States legal system for a number of reasons, obvious reasons. It infringed on it infringed on things which were clearly, which the Supreme Court had clearly said women have legal rights to. And that the Webster decision had made it so that states could reasonably restrict, but you couldn't unreasonably restrict access to an abortion. And Guam's law went very far in making it so that it was almost impossible for a woman to get an abortion. And the First Amendment issue made it so that it was never going to stand anyways. That you couldn't criminalize people for talking about it either. And so, as I said, they tried to appeal it and so on. But with before the election that year, it had already been struck down locally. And so let's talk about some of the positions. For example, Anita Arriola and her mother, Belle Arriola, and their stances. And so I mentioned earlier that there was a big rally for those who supported the anti-abortion law. It was massive, thousands of people. There was also a vigil within the week of the law being passed for those who were pro-choice, who were against the law. Nowhere near as many people showed up for that. This is a flyer from that event held at Paseo. And so Anita Arriola spoke at that event. And so, tonight I'm the proudest and happiest person in the world to see women here on Guam fighting for freedom of choice. There are many people who have asked me how I can go against my mother, how I can go up against the Catholic Church. And my response to them is this: how can I go against my conscience? And so one of the things that we see from the position of those who were pro-choice was that it was a strongly individualized position. It's about the rights of an individual woman over her body. And also it was a very American legal position. So those who tried to argue for pro-choice against the law sometimes tried to use CHamoru stuff, tried to argue that it was CHamoru culture, but really their primary argument was that this is American law. America guarantees us these freedoms. And so in many ways, the position of people like Anita Arriola and others was a very American position. It was about America says that protect that. We shouldn't go against that. And this actually turned out racially in this debate. A lot of the people who spoke out strongly against the law were white in Guam. And in fact, many of the meetings of different pro-choice groups in Guam were dominated by white women who spoke very strongly about this is, that this is wrong, this is terrible. And they saw sort of the brown people on the island as messing up the island because of their trying to go against America. And so Belle Arriola's position was different. And so here's two quotes from her from 1990 about this. There was a lot that I could have used. And if I had more time, I probably would have put more in. But so she connected it strongly to the issue of the community's right to decide what it wants for itself. And also that while Guam is taking on certain things such as indigenous rights and self-determination, she argued that this should be at the center of self-determination. Let me tell you, at the rate that Guam Memorial Hospital is aborting children between 400 and 600 a year, and most of them are not even reported, where are the lives that we are going to protect and preserve? Here we go talking about indigenous rights and self-determination. What good is all that if we don't have our followers to follow and enjoy the fruits of our labor, of this generation's labor, of your labor and my labor to fix this island and have autonomous rights to govern our people? In response to debate amongst her colleagues who argued that her bill violated the separation of church and state, she said Guam is a Christian community, that no matter which way you're going to say that this is not religion, this is not so-and-so, Mr. Speaker, I beg to differ. It's a Christian community. We decide what we are going to have here in Guam. And so while we see that Anita Arriola's position was strongly that America says that this is what we are supposed to have in Guam, because this is right, this individual freedom, this individual protection for the rights of women, that this is what's important. Bill Arriola took the position that from a community perspective, we need to prohibit abortion to protect our community, because what remains true to the day is that on Guam, CHamoru women do get abortions at higher rates than everybody else, any other race or any other ethnicity. But also that if you're going to talk about self-determination and you're going to talk about the rights of the people, this is a right too. Is that what right does the United States have to tell us about what we feel is our culture? And so Bill Arriola's position was strongly about CHamoru motherhood. And that there was a quote, I didn't have time to put it in which she was arguing that that the secularism that was coming from the United States was destroying the family, because women were now not feeling that they could have families, that they needed to have families. And so because of that, the culture was dying out, and the sense of CHamoru and the sense that women had in connection to their faith and their religion and their family was getting weakened because of something like this. And so she felt strongly that if we want to protect our culture, then you have to protect it from something like this too, which means that we have to have the ability to decide what is important in our island and not have people thousands of miles away tell us. And the person who made this the most clear, because for most people in this debate, it was, you know, I'm Catholic, so I believe in this. I'm a feminist, I believe in this, America this, CHamoru culture that. But the person who actually made the most connections was Archbishop Aparon at that time. He was a young archbishop at that time. He'd only been an archbishop a few years after the death of Archbishop Flores. But he was very active and he was very energized, and he really believed that part of Guam's self-determination and part of its decolonization was that Guam have the ability to protect the Catholic culture on the island. And so in a speech that he gave in the United States, you know, he said, if you do not know anything about CHamoros and about our struggles, you will miss the point about our decision to protect life. We are proposing a simple idea. We choose to exercise self-determination in the moral imperative, even as we pursue self-determination in the political arena. So for him, decolonizing the island was connected very much to, if we feel that we deserve something better and we have these rights, it should also extend to, if the people of Guam feel strongly that abortion is immoral, they should have the right to not have it forced on them by the United States. And yeah, examples of countries at that time, such as Ireland and the Philippines, were put out, of countries that where the government had prohibited abortion. He also argued, our island is not ours. We don't control our school system and our curriculum. We don't control the television programs that come into our airwaves. We don't control the airplanes that land. We don't control who can come to our island and build and work and benefit from our limited resources. But the one historical action that we have. And so this is where things get very, very tricky in terms of thinking about where we're at in terms of Chamorro culture and where we're at in terms of Guam's political status. Because we can see that we can see Bell Arriola speaking from one particular Chamorro experience, speaking from the perspective of a lot of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, who grew up immersed in the Catholic faith, who grew up feeling that the Catholic faith is not simply just a religion, but it's actually the key part of life, telling you what's right and wrong. But then we see Anita Arriola, who comes born into sort of the American context, the post-war American context, where religion is just a part of life. It's not the main part of life, the way Chamorros used to feel it, but it's a part of life. And that politics and government should have more power than religion in terms of deciding what's right and what's wrong for a community. And so, before I conclude, I should note that this issue is very personal for me, because these are images from the largest at that point pro-choice rally in Washington, D.C. in 1992. And so people gathered from all over, and there was a contingent of primarily nurses from Guam who attended. And here they are right here. And so this woman right here, second from the right, this is my mother, Rita Flores Lujan. And so she was, at this time, the president of the Guam Nurses Association. And so she was a strong advocate, fighting with family members, arguing with politicians, fighting her own nurses to get the Guam Nurses Association, working with her friend Lujan Bevacqua, to get the association to come out against the abortion law in Guam. And so she got to attend this. And one thing that's always been very special is that once when I was teaching world history, the book that we used in the class, it has a picture of this march in '92, where more than 500,000 people attended. And in the wide shot of the gathering of people, you can see this Guam flag in the very front, off to the right. And so yes, so I was very young at this time. I was only 10 years old. But even the rally where I quoted Anita Arriola, my mom and my grandmother also spoke at that rally as well. And I was there too, with a candle. A lot of this comes down to the issue of what is the Magahaga legacy? Because you can just say, a lot of times, you know, for those of you who took the the Chamorro values class, one of the things that we talked about with a value like Inafa Maulik is that a lot of times people will just use Inafa Maulik to mean whatever's positive. They'll just throw it out there whenever they want to just say something's good, right? Like if people are fighting, you say, hey, we need Inafa Maulik, you know, or if somebody's doing something you don't like, say, hey, we need Inafa Maulik. Or if you want to get something from somebody, you say, hey, remember Inafa Maulik. And so now, unfortunately, you can find that same sort of thing with a term like Magahaga. What is a Magahaga? Is a Magahaga just when you really like what a Chamorro woman is doing? Or when you're really proud of her, or where she seems really strong? What does it mean? Because you could argue that Anita Arriola and Bell Arriola both represented the Magahaga spirit, even if they may have been against each other. But that creates then sort of like one of the things that makes this the most tricky for me is because, for me personally, I strongly believe that a woman should have the right to choose in this context, absolutely. But in many other ideological ways, I am more in line with the arguments of Bella Arriola about Guam. I don't think, because if you, for example, if you fall in line with Anita Arriola and you feel that American law prevails in Guam, whatever America decides, Guam should follow because that's the way it is, then what happens then if America decides to prohibit something that you don't like? So for example, America in the past has prohibited the Chamorro language. So if America has the right to tell us that abortion should be legal and that women have these rights, but even if the majority of the people on Guam may not feel it should, and the law and the leaders here pass laws like this. So if America is right, and that's the way things work, what happens then when it goes against something that you don't like? Most recently, this happened with cockfighting, is that you had people who feel that cockfighting is a strong part of Chamorro culture, and the United withdrew the exception from the Animal Cruelty Act that allowed territories to still have cockfighting even if it was banned in all 50 states. And so if you don't like cockfighting, it's easy to say, well, yeah, shouldn't have cockfighting. Yeah. But what happens then if it comes time when America decides to do something that you don't like? Then do you suddenly not like American power? Or then do you not like American colonialism? So one of the things that we should remember from this is that colonialism can be progressive and colonialism can be conservative. There's no automatic ideology for colonialism, because that you can colonize in the name of liberal, progressive values. You can colonize in the name of conservative, restrictive values. And so that's what's always a little bit tricky for me about this one, is because what is Chamorro culture? What is the Magahaga legacy? Is the Magahaga legacy sort of closer to what Bella Arriola argued, or is it closer to what Anita Arriola argued? And you can say it's both, but one of the things that we always have to remember is that the choices of one generation affect the choices or the lack of choices for the next generation. So if, for example, when, what's it called? I was talking to my GCC class about this yesterday, because there was, I was talking to this older Chamorro woman who was complaining because in one of her grandchildren's classes, everybody had said they wanted to be YouTubers when they grow up. They wanted to be YouTubers, and that they wanted to go to the US, and some of them wanted to go to Britain because their favorite YouTuber is from Britain and stuff like that. And so this older woman was upset, and she's like saying, you know, what's this? You know, what is going on here? What is this? The education is failing these kids. They don't want to work. They want to just make videos for YouTube and something like that. You know, and this was at Payless, and I had to just kind of remind her. And it's weird to have conversations like this nowadays, because when you see people in public, you want to like leave them as soon as possible. You don't want to stay and talk to them for too long. But this turned out being a long conversation next to the candy in the Sinahanya Payless. And so, because I was like, well, no, I mean, Senora, actually the education system worked perfectly. Because the education system is all about focusing on developing the individual capacities of a child. They're taught to see themselves as individuals. Now, you could argue that's not in line with Chamorro values, that's not in line with Islander values, but the curriculum isn't really designed to see them as part of a collective first. It's designed to see them as individuals first. And the media, YouTube and everything else, is designed to make them see that what you personally believe and you personally are is the most important thing in the world. That you're part of a family second, you're part of a community third, but the individual is really the most important thing. So, and the educational system is designed to make them think that they need to leave island anyways. So, yeah, it makes sense that that all of our kids wouldn't really give a crap about the island and want to sort of be individuals and go off, you know, because that's what is presented to them as they're growing up, that it's important that you as an individual are fulfilled, that you as an individual get what you want. And so that's what's tricky about this, is that if you believe strongly, then is that whatever, like, I may personally disagree with Belle Arriola's position on abortion, but I also recognize that she is proposing a sense of Chamorro culture which is declining. And can you hold on to that sense of community while you are making primary the individual, that the individual is what matters, not the family, not the collective? Because when we look at how many of our lives are being affected by these sorts of things, you can see that the extended family gets smaller and smaller, that the ways that you're obligated get smaller and smaller, and that even if, for example, you may keep those things alive, a lot of times this comes down to genealogy, right? Your grandmother could tell you how everybody was related in the village. You can't do that, but you know who you're related to. Your children will know who they're related to, but they may not even know their full names. Their children may be lucky to know what village they're from, just because of how the knowledge, the sense of community, the things that bind, they can be passed on, they can be taught, but it's just as easy that they're lost. And so in the midst of all of this discussion about abortion, there's the larger issue of Chamorro culture. And can Chamorro culture be made primary in this equation, or does it have to be secondary to the sense of liberal individualism that we have embraced from the United States? Can it ever be strong? Can it ever be as strong? Maybe it can, I don't know. But it definitely makes it a little bit harder to do that. And one of the reasons is because in this debate around abortion, you know, we saw Chamorro women who were fighting for their rights and for the rights of other women. But their argument was primarily an American argument. It wasn't an argument born from within the culture and the people, because that argument was primarily the Catholic argument. So one of the things about the Magahaga legacy, though, one of the important things looking ahead is that you can reconfigure the sense of strength of a Chamorro woman. Because Belle Arriola's sense of strength is one which is kind of tied to actually, you're strong, but you're strong because you put up with a lot of things. You're strong because you endure a lot of things. Not that the community supports you, but that you have to deal with all of these barriers, and you have to deal with, you know, with all these problems. You have to take care of all these kids, but you're also supposed to support your husband. You're also supposed to work. And so for Belle Arriola, that was sort of her impression of that, is that sort of we are strong because we can do everything. We have to do everything. We should do everything for our community. So thinking about what the Magahaga means, and always being cautious that the Magahaga identity isn't something which is superficially collective, but strongly individualistic. Because that's what happens with the male Magalahia identity, is that it becomes something in which it's very much about sort of the personal ego of the masculine male expressing themselves like, I'm a warrior, I am a fighter, like that. The Magahaga can easily go the same route, in which it is simply about the self, the strong self. But where is community in that equation? And so I don't have any answer for this. And part of it is, it's not even my place necessarily to have answers for something like this. But thinking ahead for the type of community that we want, because when people were talking about self-determination it can come down to those types of choices that we make. And that it is not that we are trapped in a Catholic culture. I mean, what Archbishop Aparon said about Catholicism and Chamorro culture is true for about 200 years. But if you look back 300 years, it's not as true. And if you look today, it's not as true. So understanding that cultures change, but can these changes happen in ways that will empower us, that will empower our sense of community? Because, yeah, one of the things that always bothers me about this is that if you believed, and some people believe from this story, that the only way the abortion law was shut down was because of America. And if you believe that, you have found another way to reinforce the colonial idea that America liberates Guam. It did it from Japanese oppression in World War II, and it did it from narrow-minded Catholicism and people making these types of cultural arguments about what's right. Good thing America was there to save the island from itself. So that's why whenever we face issues like this, there always needs to be a rooting of that conversation in what we believe in, or else you could basically feel that sometimes, even when there's issues in the States, right, Guam will usually get hit by them. But we won't think about what our place is in those. I mean, I remember earlier this year, a lot of young people on Guam, suddenly became into Black Lives Matter. But that didn't necessarily mean that they understood their own issues of justice on this island. But feeling strongly that they need to stand up for Black people in the States, they need to assert that their lives matter, but then not feeling that there's any issues of justice on Guam that they need to stand up for. And that's part of the problem, is that you can, even in the name of justice, you can simply be swayed by the trends in the United States and never be fighting for your own sense of justice, but that your sense of progressive improvement will actually just be tied to your American identity. And it may end up continuing to silence sort of the Chamorro part of you. Yeah, this gets very complicated. This gets very complicated. Because for me, if you cannot come up with a locally grown and rooted argument for it, then the next generation can just assume that, oh, this is because we're America. And it won't be because the Chamorro people believed in this. It won't be because it's connected to the values of the people. It'll be just because Uncle Sam said this is the law. And then the next generation is just like, oh, I guess this is what we believe in, because this is how things are. Sidrus Mase. Oh, that's such an intense conversation.
Senor,
question.
I wanted to share. Last week, I had class while I was visiting DC, and when you mentioned that C. Vicente Blas was buried in Arlington, I had made a plan to go the next day because I needed to go pay my respects to this person who was a soldier, and then they didn't get mind warped and decided to fight for our people. I was just like, this story was so captivating to me. So I was going there, and my cousin, she called me and she asked me what I was doing, and I told her I'm gonna go see like this guy, Ben Blas, his grave. And she's like, Leah, that's Grandma Bomba's friend, like really good friend. You should ask in the chat about it. And so my Auntie Betty had shared that he was actually the last person that my grandmother had spoke to on the phone in her deathbed. And she was talking to him about war reparations. And that was the last conversation she had, like in the 80s via like telephone, was with him before he had spoke in front of Congress. So that was just such a magical, like serendipitous thing that happened to me from this class. And I feel like it just keeps happening every time I learn something about our culture and I don't connect it to myself, somehow it finds its way. So, se duas mãos.
No, that's, I mean, you want those connections. I mean, that's, we say that, you know, being Chamorro, it's a small island, it's a small world, right? But one thing that's really nice is, you know, we say like cousins, you know, we've all got cousins, we've got friends, connections here and there. But what's always nice is, and I wish that I could do it better too, is that for like our grandparents' generation, the closeness was tied to deep knowledge, deep, intricate knowledge of connections. Like, you know, you didn't need ancestry.com because your nana knew just about everything. And we don't have that. We don't have that. It's like how you used to be able to remember 100 numbers, and now you remember just a handful of numbers. And so, you know, we want to learn this history because we want to understand our connections, right? But then you also then have to think, what do we do so that the next generation can understand them, right? I know about most of my branches from my family. For my family, I don't know about my grandfather because my grandfather was bad at genealogy, of course. He's a Chamorro dude. They tend to statistically not be good at genealogy. Now, there's a few that sort of defy that stereotype. But my grandmother was great at it. And so by me spending lots of time with her, going to funerals and even writing things down, writing notes down about how people are connected, you know, eventually for her side, you know, I could tell you, I could go back and connect generations, you know, go back 4 or 5 generations and connect people, you know. And so interestingly enough, yeah, with like Ben Blas, you know, I could tell you how the Deru clan is related to the Kotla clan and related. And Ben Blas, of course, he wasn't a second cousin. He was a pretty close cousin. His family was pretty close to my grandma's family. But why is it that families don't pass that on anymore? What amazes me now is that Chamorros used to make fun of white people, and actually other ethnicities too, because they would know like their first cousins and they wouldn't really know anyone else beyond that. But I can tell you lots of young Chamorro people that only know their first cousins nowadays. It's the norm. Maybe they know their second cousins. Depending on how active their clan is, maybe they know their second cousins. But so what is keeping us from passing on the knowledge of how we are connected to each other? The US Navy isn't telling us we can't do it. But why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we filling in the gaps? The way that sort of like when you're driving to a funeral, traditionally when you're young, your grandmother or your mother is supposed to fill in the gaps. And you just remember like a part of it because, you know, who wants to listen to their old grandmother tell them stories about districts and barrios in Hagatna before World War II? Oh my goodness, these people are all dead. What does this matter? But so that's why these connections and these stories are important, because we have to fill in these gaps. And the more that we fill them in, the more that the next generation will feel that this Chamorro thing is exciting and it's interesting and it's full of life, right? There's something magical when you know, so when you look at like a faded black and white photograph, it has some charm and it has some interest. But one of the most amazing things is when you can talk to somebody about that photograph and they can tell you the people in it and they can say, this is this person. Oh, and you know, this person was neighbors with your auntie, you know, and where they're standing here in this picture like this is because, you know, is that we should fill in those gaps. We should pass on those stories so that this thing that we say we are Chamorro, this thing we are, isn't just a t-shirt, that it's way more than just something that you can put on a t-shirt, right? It's way more than something that you can just get as a tattoo. It's way more than something you could put into a pack of cookies. Something like that. So, but we got to tell those stories. We got to tell those stories. And one reason why I've almost probably irritatingly always talk about Chamorro identity in relation to the United States is because if you don't make room, oftentimes intentionally making room for the Chamorro in the way you talk to the next generation, then they're not going to get much, because it'll just be filled with the United States, or it'll be filled with Disney. And that's the way it is. I mean, even thinking about me, my daughter was amazed the other day when I could sing almost all the songs from like 10 Disney movies. Because I was like, oh, because I'm a 80s and 90s kid. And we all had Disney VHS tapes, and we all watched them until the tape went ragged and barely worked anymore. And so we all kind of, if you grew up at that time, you watched those, and that was part of your upbringing. And when you think about it, it's kind of sad that, I mean, I encountered this years ago when I was first doing oral history research, and I remember I was at UOG, and I met a young woman who, a young Chamorro woman, and I had spent time with her grandfather a few weeks before. And, you know, her grandfather had been part of the Guam Congress walkout. Her grandfather had been a strong voice for, you know, for the rights of the Chamorro people. And when I talked to her, she didn't know anything about that. No, her grandfather and her family hadn't brought it up to the next generation. Her parents hadn't told them about it much, but I was like shocked and amazed. And she was a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and she had intricate knowledge about all of these Lord of the Rings characters, like not just in the movies and the main books, but like people from like the First Age, the Second Age, you know, if you're familiar with stuff like that. You know, everyone knows Gandalf, right? But then she knew that there was also 2 blue wizards. There's Radagast the Brown. Anyways, but so, yeah, I know a lot about Lord of the Rings too. But so she wanted to talk in depth about Lord of the Rings, and it kind of broke me in a certain way, because I was like, I would rather talk about your grandfather. Your grandfather's cool. Your grandfather's awesome. I don't want to talk about like these Lord of the Rings characters. I mean, I like them, but I was amazed that she cared more about Legolas than her grandfather's legacy. But that's what happens. That's what happens if you don't pass the stories on. That's what happens if you, I always go back to the poem Kidnapped. If you get careless about your culture, is that it's basically like a crapshoot. You leave what the identity and what the values your children will have up to whatever is around them. And what might happen is that after they reach a certain point, they might crave and desire something that wasn't given to them. But it's always nicer to give somebody a language, to give somebody their stories, and have them even not appreciate it for a while, rather than have that feeling that I'm part of something beautiful and you kept it from me. Like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you share this with me? This is so cool. This is who we are. Why did you feel like it wasn't important? So that's why for me, I'm always like, yeah, these stories fill your world with Chamorro stuff. Fill the lives of your children with Chamorro things, because you don't need to talk to them about Johnny Appleseed or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, because everybody else in the universe is going to talk to them about those sorts of things. It's your responsibility. You can talk about those things, but it's your responsibility to tell them where their oldest lines are from, which is the Marianas, which is from Guam. And you got to do that, because chances are good very few other people are going to do that. But yeah, so that's why it's so cool. I have always loved that Chamorro connection. That's why even me, I do it. If you say somebody's name, I'll be like, oh yeah, no, I have like some random connection to that, because that's a very Chamorro thing to do. Oh yeah. That person had their granddaughter as like a student once. It's kind of irritating, but it's a very Chamorro thing to do, because when you connect to people, you have to establish some way of understanding your connection to them. You have to put out your clan names. You have to establish what village are you from. You have to give some coordinates so we can understand each other. But yeah, these stories are part of that. That's true. The young generation is definitely not always interested in those sorts of things. Oh yeah, that is so unfortunate that the teacher said that. Very common, unfortunately. Oof. What's interesting? So what's interesting in the diaspora is that sometimes people in the diaspora are more knowledgeable about these sorts of things because there's a feeling that they're more scarce versus people in the islands who take them for granted. That's why if anyone ever tells you that sort of the people in the diaspora are lost or confused or don't know anything, yeah, there's some people that may be like that. There's also those people on Guam too. Just because you have a Chad accent doesn't mean you have a strong Chamorro identity. You know, just because you, yeah. And so one of the benefits of being in the diaspora, though, can be that if you have that feeling that you're going to lose your connection, it may encourage you to do more to try to keep that connection. Right? Whereas in Guam, if you just feel like, oh yeah, you know, everyone's Chamorro, there's Chamorro this, Chamorro that. And so you don't take it as seriously because you feel it's all around you or it's always there. And so sometimes the diaspora can move quicker and in more intentional ways to take on stuff like this, because they recognize that if they don't, then, oh no, Tazuga. If they don't, then yeah, there's no other chance, right? It's like on Guam, you'll always be like, oh, there's going to be another Chamorro month. I could always learn it then. But in the States, you don't have that to fall back on. So, and that's what I love nowadays about sort of thinking about what can happen in the States, in the diaspora, is that any idea that the diaspora like is, yeah, that it can't match up to people in the islands, nah, it's silly, it's stupid. Doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's things that the diaspora can do and they should do, and we should encourage each other. So if, for example, the diaspora has access to certain things that people in the islands don't, then we should definitely be like Tsinsuli about it, right? Is that if the diaspora, for example, if some people in the diaspora have more access to more resources, then they can funnel those resources into Guam, and then people in Guam can provide language or cultural resources to go back out into the diaspora. You look at what you have and you don't have, and then you exchange, you trade, you barter. Oh, hey, Biba, si tun bendero. Hey, pues parentes hit. We're related to them. And so, ay, buena señora. No, thank you for letting me know that. I love it when I love it when people share their family connections like that. And so, but this is our second to the last meeting. This is our second to the last meeting. And so for the next one, I'm still not sure what I want to do for the last one, but we'll close things off. I'll find an interesting way to close things off. But yes, any final questions before I head out? All right, Biba. No, sidusmasi no hamzu tatlu. Thank you to all of you again. Adios. Estaque I until we see each other again. Esta.